A Polish DP asked Patton if Poland was free. Patton couldn't look him in the eye. May 1945. The mud in Regensburg smells like wet ash and old wool. General George S. Patton, Jr. dacks through the displaced persons camp with 4 aides, his polished boots cutting clean lines through the dirt. A man steps directly out of a crowd of thousands. Jan Kowalsski, 34, wearing a dead soldier's coat, stops 3 feet from the 3-star general. In his left hand, he holds a small red and white cloth Polish flag, frayed at the edges and stained with oil. He looks Patton in the face. His voice is flat, heavy, and wet with quiet desperation. "General," he asks, "is Warsaw free now?" The surrounding officers freeze. Nobody moves. Major General Ernest Harman halts 2 steps behind, his jaw tightening. Captains and aides instantly calculate the distance, the breach of protocol, the total breakdown of military etiquette in front of a displaced population. A young Women's Army Corps clerk, Sergeant Dolores Kaminsky, stops typing on her portable desk, her fingers locked above the keys. Everyone in that mud courtyard waits for the thunder. General Patton stops. He looks at the small red and white cloth Polish flag in the man's hand. He does not reach for his ivory-handled revolver. He does not yell. What happened in the next 60 seconds would reveal the terrible, unwritten price of a war that was supposed to be over. And the answer was not what anyone in that courtyard was prepared for. If you want more untold stories from World War II, hit that subscribe button. Let me back up a second, because to understand what it cost Jan Kowalski to ask that question, you need to understand what the displaced persons camps in the American zone actually were in May 1945. They were not modern relief centers with structured intake protocols and endless supplies. They were overcrowded, improvised collection points set up in former German army barracks, abandoned munitions factories, and muddy fields outside ruined transit hubs like Regensburg. In the weeks following the German surrender, millions of former forced laborers, liberated concentration camp survivors, and displaced civilians flooded the roads of Central Europe. They were hungry, exhausted, and destitute, speaking dozens of different languages while trying to figure out if their homes still existed, or if their families were still alive. The unwritten rules of these camps were shaped by raw military triage and sheer operational survival. American officers and military police were overwhelmed, managing populations the size of small cities with limited rations, minimal transport, and constant fears of typhus outbreaks. Order depended on strict chain-of-command hierarchy and rigid protocol. Displaced persons were expected to stand in orderly lines, wait for processing, and speak only when addressed through official interpreters. To break rank, cross an armed escort, and physically approach a 3-star general was not just a breach of military decorum. It was a dangerous gamble that risked immediate removal, detention, or violent misunderstanding by nervous guards on high alert. Yet the question Kowalski asked was the exact calculation every single displaced Pole in Western Europe was making in silence. They had spent 5 years under a brutal German occupation that systematically dismantled their nation. They had watched from afar as the Warsaw Uprising was crushed in late 1944 while Soviet forces waded across the Vistula River. Now, with the German surrender signed, the strategic reality of Europe was shifting in real time. The Allied powers were carving up boundaries, and the political future of Poland was being decided in closed rooms by diplomats and military commanders far above the muddy courtyards of Bavaria. Consider the military arithmetic confronting the Third Army headquarters that month. Over 200,000 displaced Polish citizens were jammed into American-controlled camps across southern Germany alone. Each person represented a complex logistical equation of 800 calories of daily rations, 4 square feet of canvas or shelter, and an indefinite timeline for repatriation. If Poland was sovereign and secure, those men could be put on eastbound rail cars within 48 hours, clearing precious transport corridors and freeing up entire divisions of occupation troops. If it was not, those hundreds of thousands of people became a permanent human responsibility, stranded between 2 rival geopolitical blocs, and that was the mud courtyard John Kowalski stepped forward in. Picture the scene. It is mid-morning in the Regensburg courtyard, and the air is heavy with the damp, sour smell of wet wool and wood smoke. Nearly 3,000 displaced persons stand pressed against the wooden barriers, their faces pale and drawn under the gray Bavarian sky. The silence in that muddy square is absolute. Every eye is fixed on the space between the 3-star general and the Polish laborer. Behind Patton, His military aides and staff officers stand frozen, their breath rising in thin white plumes. They are calculating the danger of the moment, watching the perimeter guards, who have brought their carbines to their chests. In the middle of it all stands Sergeant Dolores Kaminsky, her portable desk resting on an upturned wooden crate. She holds her breath, her fingers hovering over the keys of her typewriter, watching a man from her parents' homeland address the most feared commander in Europe. Stay with me, because what happened next in that courtyard is the part nobody was expecting. Everyone present knew General Patton's history. They knew about his explosive temper, his ruthless demand for military discipline, and the famous incidents in Sicily where he had no patience for those he thought lacked resolve. The officers fully braced themselves for a sudden roar of outrage, a harsh command to clear the courtyard, or a lecture on military order. They expected the general to assert his absolute authority over a chaotic crowd. The accounts that survive are consistent in shape. General Patton did not roar. He did not issue a command to clear the courtyard, not the way a general looks at an insolent interruption, not the way a man looks at something that has irritated his sense of order. He looked at Jan Kowalski the way a man looks at a debt that cannot be paid. The general stood frozen in the Bavarian mud, his jaw set hard. Slowly, deliberately, Patton reached out his right arm. He placed his hand squarely on Kowalski's thin shoulder, feeling the damp, coarse wool of the dead soldier's coat. The three-star general looked down at the mud beneath their boots, staring in absolute silence for 5, 10, 15 seconds. The silence hung over the 3,000 spectators like iron weight. He did not say a single word. He could not look the Polish laborer in the eye. Patton removed his hand, turned on his heel, and walked away down the narrow dirt lane, his steps slow and uncharacteristically heavy. Sergeant Dolores Kaminsky later described that departure with one word: crushed. She noted in her private journal that it was the only time she ever saw General George S. Patton Jr. looked entirely defeated by a situation he could not control with tanks, artillery, or raw willpower. See, what most folks don't realize is that Patton understood the political map of Europe far better than his critics ever gave him credit for. He knew that while the war against Nazi Germany was officially over, a dark geopolitical tragedy was already unfolding. The political agreements made at Yalta had effectively placed Poland under Soviet dominance. Warsaw was cleared of German troops. Yes, but it was not free in any sense that a Polish patriot understood the word. Patton was a master of grand strategy, and he recognized the cold, brutal arithmetic of the broad Allied strategy. The Western Allies were tired. Millions of troops wanted to go home, and there was zero political appetite in Washington or London to challenge the Soviet army over the sovereignty of Eastern Europe. To tell Kowalski the truth was to break the heart of a man who had survived years of slave labor on a lie of coming liberation. To lie to him was beneath the honor of a soldier. Patton's total silence was the only honest response left to a commander who had the military power to liberate cities, but lacked the political authority to give a nation its freedom. Every officer who served under General George S. Patton Jr. during the European campaign understood that the Third Army operated at a tempo unmatched by any other command. Decisions that would take days in rear echelon headquarters were executed in minutes along the forward line, driven by Patton's belief that speed, audacity, and relentless pressure were the ultimate life-saving tools on a battlefield. Yet this relentless drive was balanced by an unyielding respect for practical competence on the ground, proving time and again that a commander who listens to physical ground truth is a commander who achieves decisive victory. The historical records preserved from the Third Army's advance across Europe demonstrate a consistent pattern. Tactical momentum relied not merely on grand strategic maps, but on the quiet, unheralded competence of ordinary soldiers doing their duty under extreme pressure. Whether in the freezing mud of the Ardennes or the dust of western France, moments of unexpected courage and technical precision defined the true character of the Allied war effort. Military historians who study the European theater often note that leadership in combat requires a rare combination of absolute authority and quiet humility. To command hundreds of thousands of men across enemy territory demands unwavering resolve, but to recognize the truth when presented by a lower-ranking subordinate requires genuine greatness of character. Jan Kowalski grew up on the eastern bank of the Vistula River in Radom, a city built on the weight of iron foundries and leather tanneries. His father, Tomasz Kowalski, was a master machinist who spent 30 years maintaining the heavy presses at the local arms factory. Tomasz was a precise, unsentimental man who believed that a tool either worked or it did not, and that a man who ignored clear measurements was bound to ruin his own labor. He taught young Jan how to read blueprints before the boy was 10. Laying out calibrated steel calipers on the kitchen table after supper, Jan carried that exactness into his work as a junior draftsman at the municipal waterworks, measuring pipe gradients and pressure tolerances for the city engineer. He married a school teacher named Maria in the spring of 1938. They had a small apartment near the railroad line with white curtains and 2 red clay pots of geraniums on the windowsill. When the German army rolled through Radom in September 1939, Jan was pulled from his drawing desk and assigned to a forced labor battalion, eventually transferred to a locomotive repair shop near Munich. For 5 years he measured piston clearances under guard, keeping his head down and his hands moving, surviving on thin cabbage broth and the absolute conviction that the war would end with his home restored. When he asked General Patton if Warsaw was free, he was not looking for a political speech. He was asking if the measurements of his life still added up. When Kowalski returned to his assigned wooden barracks, after Patton walked away, he did not weep or raise his voice. He sat down on his straw mattress, pulled a small wooden comb from his pocket, and began cleaning the lint from its teeth. When another laborer asked him what the American commander had said, Kowalski simply shook his head and smoothed the corner of the small red and white cloth Polish flag across his knees, tucking it back into his breast pocket. He returned to his daily routine of gathering firewood and waiting for transport orders, his demeanor as quiet and steady as it had been before the general arrived. He was not a romantic hero. He was the kind of man who measured reality by what stood in front of him, and he accepted the general's silence as a final calculation. Sergeant Dolores Kaminsky stayed in the Women's Army Corps through the end of the demobilization period, returning home to Chicago in November 1946. She opened a small secretarial service on Milwaukee Avenue, married a steel mill clerk, and raised 3 children in a brick bungalow on the city's northwest side. She rarely spoke about her time in Bavaria, but kept her wartime journal locked in a tin box inside her bedroom dresser until her death in 2011. In the margin of the entry dated May 18, 1945, beneath her description of Patton's heavy departure, she had written a single line in dark blue ink. Some truths are too heavy for any man to speak out loud. Was General Patton right to stand in complete silence and walk away without giving Jan Kowalski a direct answer? Some would say he failed a basic moral obligation to provide clarity to a victim of war, arguing that an American Army commander owed a displaced civilian a direct statement of the political truth, no matter how bitter or harsh that truth might be. Others would say exactly the opposite, contending that offering false hope would have been a cruel deception, while speaking the bleak geopolitical reality aloud to a broken man would have been an act of unnecessary brutality, leaving an honest, shared silence as the only compassionate gesture left to a soldier who understood the limits of his own authority. Let us know in the comments below, and if you want more untold stories from World War II, make sure you subscribe.